thank you so much for coming to talk with us. The students have read the beginning of your incredible book, The Torture Doctors, and we've been talking about torture this week. It would be great if you could start maybe with how you got interested in this subject, and then talk a little bit about, what you found in doing the research for your book, because as I don't think I mentioned to you all, this book was a finalist for our Mendez Prize, which is a prize for best book on Latin America and human rights. And this was one of the, top 5 books. We really loved it, the judges. So we wanted to just learn a little bit more about how you got interested in this, how you researched it. And then I know the students have a number of questions, so we can then go to Q&A after that. Does that sound all right?
Yep, sounds great.
Great.
There was during the War on Terror, pictures came out of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, which showed US soldiers abusing prisoners. And some of these were really extreme. Waterboarding, for example, that we had defined as torture and as a war crime several times in our history. Things like putting a prisoner inside of a sleeping bag, beating him with a bat, tying it with wire, and then sitting on him until he died and he had multiple fractured, and so forth. And one of the things that impressed me was every prison has a medical staff. And so I wondered how it was possible. How did the military suppress the protests from the medical staff of this abuse of prisoners? And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was downloading Freedom of Information Act documents from the US government. They were submitting a request. The documents were scrubbed and then released. And eventually they got about 100,000 pages or so. And various researchers would just kind of download these from the ACLU website and take a look at them. For example, there was a group of people who were looking at questions of what was the Secretary of Defense's role, what was the CIA's role, and so forth. And I foolishly decided to do what are the doctors' role, partly because nobody seemed interested in it, and partly because it takes a doctor to evaluate what doctors do. For example, you can take a look at a death certificate. There's the information on it, and there's the information that should be on it that's missing. And a doctor is better equipped to spot that type of stuff. Part of the problem was that the medical policies for the War on Terror prisons were scattered across Defense Department, CIA, FBI. They were scattered across multiple sites. They ran up to the White House, down through the cabinet. It was a huge pile of stuff. I think I eventually read somewhere around 60,000 pages. Furthermore, the way the government had released these was they had used blackout pen to delete material, and then they had done a Xerox copy of that, and then they'd release that. And what that did was it meant it was impossible to use a search term strategy to identify any word in a PDF file. So basically, I just had to read these, learn the content well enough, and cross-link the documents to build files. A death certificate here, an investigation, NCIS investigation there, and recompile all these. And then I built an enormous online database, which is with the Minnesota Human Rights Library. And what I found was that doctors were not, their protests against these policies were not suppressed, but rather that the doctors and psychologists were integrated into the process of abusing prisoners, and that they had been willing in the role that they did with regard to these practices. I wrote a whole bunch of articles, and I wrote a book, and then it went into a second edition, and then all that jazz. But then I got interested in the question of, well, what's the pattern globally? How do we contextualize what the US experience was with regard to international practices? And so I started, I just took the Google, daily notification system, and I plugged in the word doctors and tortures into a number of different languages and just let it run once a day for about 8 years. Okay, and then every day I would look at it and pull out the documents that were interesting, and then have the ones that looked like hits, have them checked more carefully rather than using a Google translator. What I found, to make a long story short, was that doctors are built into the torture system around the world in at least 100 different countries. They are a standard part of the torture system everywhere torture is now practiced. What they do is they falsify documents like death certificates and medical records to conceal the fact that torture has occurred. Number two, they modify torture techniques so that the torture technique is less likely to leave scars. Waterboarding is a nice example. Whipping, for example, leaves scars, especially on people from Africa who get a condition called keloid. And what they do is they modify these torture techniques so that they don't leave evidence. The third thing that they do is they help tighter the torture or adjust the torture up and down so that the person who's supposed to live lives without being killed by the torture. They'll help monitor, for example, the breathing of an asthmatic who has a sandbag put over his head so that person does not die while the sandbag's over their head. And so 3 roles: false documentation to conceal torture. The second one is no scars. And the third one is keeping prisoners alive who are supposed to stay alive are the major roles. And then there were some other minor variants. It's important to understand when we get underway in this discussion that the utility of torture as an interrogation technique it has been repeatedly researched, and torture does not gain valid information. In fact, it decreases the likelihood of getting intelligence, and the information that it gets is wrong. And so what happens is it winds up sending troops or police out on dangerous missions that don't have a justification. The second thing that torture does is that when a population finds out that its people are being tortured, they engage in retaliatory torture of government personnel. It also encourages the tortured population to fight to the last person because they don't want to be tortured. Torture makes it impossible to recruit human intelligence, which is always the best kind of intelligence, because a tortured person is essentially non-recruitable. The only person you can torture and cause them to do useful work are grad students. And
That's for you, Joe.
and then the other thing that's fascinating, for example, when the pictures came out from Iraq, was that before the torture became disclosed at Abu Ghraib, 80% of the Iraqis were in favor of US involvement to get rid of Hussein. But after that came out, it dropped to, I think about 30% or so instantly. And what that meant was that the troops were going around in an environment that was much more hostile to their presence. and also an environment that was much more likely to hide, to not reveal who is planting, say, improvised explosive devices and so forth. So torture is not only doesn't work, but it's enormously counterproductive and is essentially a folkways rather than an evidence validated technique. And
Just if we could start, maybe ask you to talk a little bit historically about the role of doctors in, say, human rights abuses, and I'm thinking, 20th century, because this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that.
yeah, you can go quite a bit further back. In the Middle Ages, doctors played a role in torture in certifying that women were not pregnant because a woman who was pregnant could not be tortured. And so they had these doctors in prisons who would determine whether or not the pregnancy was over. Later on during the French Revolution, for example, the procedure for killing people was essentially breaking them on the wheel, that is tying them to a big wheel and then hammering them to death. And Dr. Guillotine developed decapitation. And decapitation was known, of course, before, but it was reserved for the upper class. And among the reforms in the French Revolution was that equal opportunity to decapitation was granted as a more humane means of execution. During the period of slavery, whipping of slaves was justified because slaves who wanted to escape slavery were medically diagnosed with the condition of drapetomania, that is an unreasonable manic desire to escape slavery. And of course, the cure for drapetomania was flogging. But it's important to note that also during that period of time, a whole medical ideology of Black slaves came up that said they are less likely to feel pain, so therefore the pain has to be ratcheted up higher in order to communicate with them. And so torture was tied to medical racism. Medical racism, of course, was a central role in Nazi medicine during the 40s, which included medical participation in the classification, the pseudo classification of gypsies, Jews, homosexuals, and their internment in camps, and also then regarded them as essentially lower versions of humans, which, since they were going to die in the camp anyway, they might as well give up some scientific value by being subjected to horrendously brutal experiments. That led to a very interesting trial right at the end of World War II, where about a dozen doctors were actually tried for war crimes. Some of them were executed, some of them were imprisoned, but the trial was actually aborted while it was underway, as 1,600 doctors were brought to, doctors and scientists from the Nazi regime were brought to the United States to participate in war research for the Cold War against Russia. And the US was literally stealing defendants off of the Nuremberg defendants list, even as the trial was underway. And then after that, even though there was a promise that doctors would never engage in the war crimes again, and that was asserted in Geneva in 1953, as well as in the non-specifically in the Declaration of Human Rights in 1946. The first doctor to be punished for torture was accidentally punished in 1975. And at that point, people only noted that he was a soldier and nobody commented on the fact that he was a doctor. He was discovered in retrospect when people went after Soviet psychiatry.
Great, thank you. We have a bunch of questions. Vera, do you want to start with your, just say what your name is and make sure you can, so he can hear you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Zavera. So my question is, so I think we only read the first two chapters of your book, and you talked a lot about how doctors did not become torture doctors because they were threatened with torture themselves, for the most part. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why, like the reasons why they did. Like, did they think they were part of some kind of humanitarian cause or something like that? I don't know if you could comment a little bit on that.
Right. The reason docs torture is basically that they are careerists. Doctors are so important to the torturing process right now that they are offered high rank and very high pay. The doctors, for example, who worked for the Nazis were given very special ranks. And so for a doc in a poor country, you can get an instant wage supplement and instant promotion, which translates down the road into retirement benefits as well. These docs tend to be very conservative politically. They tend to have heightened sense of right and wrong. They tend to be highly patriotic in the conservative sense of the word, so that their personal political ideology matches the idea of torture. The third thing that has to be said is that docs as a group tend to be politically conservative. And so there's this rather interesting process by which the doctors community is allied with the regime when the regime is torturing. And then as the society fights back against the regime because it tortures, the docs tend to move to a more central position and then can become one of the leading constituencies against torture.
I wonder, Dr. Miles, if you could tell us like a story of someone who sticks in your mind as really exemplifying this careerist who engages in this kind of behavior, somebody that you may have talked about in your book?
Well, for example, you take that guy, I think you read the story of Dr. Chan Sees a Burn Boy. Okay. Now, Dr. Chand, all of that stuff is actually, I got off of the pages of the newspaper down there. They did a great job. Human Rights Group fed them material and they kept printing it. Dr. Chan was just a primary care doc. In Guyana, that means that he had an annual salary of somewhere around $2,000–3,000 a year. And by taking the extra job of prison duty, he could essentially increase his salary by about 50%. Okay. Dr. Chand was a doc who did not know anything about human rights and indeed had disrespect for it, and also had a sense that human rights was simply another word for left-wing politics. And so when he got called to see this kid who the police had poured lighter fluid on his genitals and lit it up, Dr. Chan did not look at the kid. He got a little ointment. He said, use a little ointment on this burn. He later said it was a first-degree burn. The pictures of the burn were shown on were on the front page of the newspaper. It was easily a second and third degree burn. He didn't report the police who burned the boy to any human rights authority, whereas he would be obliged, say, to report child abuse if child abuse came into his clinic. But basically, he just bought into his position as the house physician for the police and did not do so out of fear, but out of a vocational accommodation with what the police asked him to do.
How about a question from online? Yeah, just go ahead and speak up. Quiet, okay. How about in here? Is there any questions from in here? Go ahead, Zach, say your name then.
Sure. Hey, I'm Zach, and I guess I was wondering what a typical American torture doctor looks like, and whether like those are mostly outside of the US or whether they're in the US, and also to what extent, I guess to how you're defining torture, like is the kind of violence that you're looking at only for politically motivated aims, or are you also looking at violence that could just occur at the hands of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. Torture used in international law has a very specific definition because you often see torture used, say, in newspapers in the United States, like, you know, some psychopath will take some girl and put her in the basement of his house and torture her and sexually abuse her for months at a time. That's not torture by international law. Torture by international law is the intentional infliction of severe pain and suffering by an official, government official, acting in an official capacity for any purpose whatsoever. Now, the reason that this is an important definition is that torture is not an attack on an individual. It's a state weapon against a class of individuals, even though it's done to one person. You don't torture, say, a person who holds up a garage or a gas station. Torture is aimed at intelligentsia. It's aimed at journalists, student leaders, union representatives. It's aimed at opposition political parties. It's a weapon of the state to maintain control most of the time that it's used. But it's very important to recognize that the infliction of pain and suffering by an individual against another individual it can be battery, homicide, assault, rape, and so forth. And even though those crimes are done in the course of torture, torture refers to when it's done by a government.
Was there a part of your question, Zach, about the United States?
Yeah. What does like a typical American torture doctor look like, and where are they based?
From the United States?
Yeah.
Oh, in the United States, what they did was in these U.S. prisons, they for war on terror, first off, they had a bounty system to bring the prisoners in. And the bounty system, when the U.S. was offering, say, $200, $500, $700 bounty system in Afghanistan, this became an extraordinarily lucrative way to settle individual disputes in Afghanistan. So more than 80% of the prisoners who got to Guantanamo were completely innocent of any anti-US activity, and same in Iraq. The torture that was done, the way the physicians and psychologists got involved was that the prisoners were put in prison, and then you have the interrogators, the translators, okay, and then you have the intelligence officials who say, what information do we want to get from this person? And then the way they involved the physicians was they said, we're going to create a behavioral science consultation team, which is going to devise a way to scientifically break this person down. So for example, this person is afraid of dogs, so let's have lunging of dogs at this person. This person is a devout Muslim, let's feed him pork and tell him that afterwards. This person wants to pray, let's not tell him when Ramadan is. This person could probably be stressed to the point where they would stop resisting the interrogator if they had 36 hours of sleep deprivation, then 12 hours of no sleep, then 12 hours of sleep, and then another 36 hours of sleep deprivation, and repeat that over 3 weeks. And what that does is it keeps shifting their circadian rhythm by 12 hours every cycle. And the theory was that if you did that, then the person would be less able to resist the questions. The point is that there was never any empirical basis for this. And in fact, it had all been, all of that information, all the theories behind that had been rejected by years of research after World War II.
We can flip this and talk about the victims of torture from a medical perspective.
Yeah.
What happens to human beings when they've been tortured?
Torture is essentially like, the victims of torture are somewhere around 60 to 70% develop severe PTSD. There is another group, though, that is resilient. And the resilient group has been the object of a fair amount of research recently, because the resilient group are people who, oddly enough, expect to be tortured. And so they are prepared for torture, and they view it as part of the experience of carrying on their noble cause. One of the things that torture does to the victims is it shifts them from being political opponents to thinking of themselves as engaged in a holy crusade against the torturing regime. And some researchers believe that once you torture somebody, they're more likely to become a suicide bomber, for example. In addition, you got to realize that there's a set of secondary trauma, secondary PTSD that occurs to the family of those who are tortured and the loved ones of those who are tortured. And then not to be neglected is the incidence of PTSD, which is probably in the range of 40 to 50% of torturers themselves. That is, the desensitization of torturers does not hold stable over a long period of time. And many of these individuals become extremely disturbed human beings after serving as torturers.
You know, we had a guest a couple years ago, I'm not gonna remember his last name, but he had been an interrogator in Iraq and Afghanistan. And even though he'd written a book about it and talked about it, he was visibly still affected by it as someone who had tortured. You know, someone who really still showed that PTSD and, you know, incredibly deep sense of remorse.
Yeah, that this is a, you know, clearly the researchers, the resources for survivors of torture are very, very limited. But when the torturers go to places like the VA, they have a very hard time getting services for their own mental health because of the stigmatization of being a torturer. And actually, I was after I wrote the first book, Oath Betrayed, I got invited to a CIA conference just outside of Langley, and the sense of shock and remorse in the room in the conferences was really palpable, which does not excuse what happened.
Other questions from Ryan, or just say your names?
Hi, I'm Ryan, and I just had a question about, so you mentioned like specific percentages of victims and the torturers that got PTSD. I was wondering if there's any similar numbers for doctors. There's like a certain percentage of them that got PTSD for
playing a role, even if it was indirect, in torture?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
You can take your mask off, Brian.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Ryan. So my question was, you provided some percentages and numbers of victims and torturers that got PTSD from participating in torture. I was wondering if there were any similar numbers to doctors that participated in torture, like whether it's indirectly or directly.
Like, do doctors have PTSD also from having participated?
Yeah, well, virtually everybody gets PTSD from torture. There's even PTSD in people who treat torture survivors, which is another form of secondary PTSD. So this is a enormously traumatic experience, and the problem really is that you've got a process called torture. There are about 200 countries in the world that's probably practiced in around 150 countries. And in some places, for example, like East Africa, up by Somalia, Eritrea, that area, 30% of the population has been tortured. And 40 to 50% of the refugees from that area have been tortured, because people who've been tortured are especially likely to leave. And so this is an extraordinary burden on world public health. Thinking about it from a public health perspective too, since torture is aimed at the elite, the politicians, the journalists, the teachers, the union leaders, and so forth, what it does is it causes a selective form of brain drain that takes out people who are most productive and most needed for a country's economic development.
Go
There's
ahead.
an echo coming off your mics. That's why.
Sorry. Joe, I wanted to see if you had a question.
Yeah.
Joe is a graduate student, Dr. Miles, so you can be kind to him.
Okay. Oh, grad student?
Yes.
Yeah, and cultural anthropology. But I really appreciate your coming and speaking to us today. And, you know, when I was the age of some of the undergrads, I was involved in this organization called Witness Against Torture, which is trying to close Guantanamo Bay in the late years of Bush Jr.'s presidency and the early years of Obama's presidency. So one of the questions that I have is about how you've seen either justice processes after torture through Truth and Reconciliation, through other kinds of commissions that have tried to heal some of the wounds of torture. Those have been successful. They haven't been successful, what it would take for them to be successful. And then my other question has to do with this question of people who are survivors of torture who are trying to seek refugee protections and asylum protections. And if you could speak to the way that how trauma makes it difficult for people to produce some of the evidence required for them within the immigration system. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, so fine if you're not. But the kinds of memories and coherent order of events that's often required to prove that they're telling the truth, how torture makes that challenging.
Okay, two-part question. Remind me about the second part. First part, in terms of the rectification or addressing the harms of torture, I personally think of it as going in a series of concentric rings that go outward from the victim. First duty is the duty to provide treatment to the victim and the immediate community or family of the victim. We must have healing. These people must have resources in their own country. If they stay there, they must have resources if they come here. The idea of not covering torture on a person who has a irregular immigrant status is simply wrong. We don't gain anything by having that kind of pain, that kind of suffering, that kind of dysfunctional parenting and work life and community life loose in our society. They must be treated. The second circle out is the damage that is done to the torturers and the torturers' societies. And this includes dealing with the secondary PTSD and also to the irregular cultures of the torturing organization that caused it to accept torture in the chain of command. And they always do so with the promise of impunity to the torturer. And that means accountability, and it also means institutional reform. It means transparency of those institutions. The third concentric circle has to do with the damage of torture to the society which has been damaged by torture. Iraq, for example, has been damaged by torture. And this is more than the individual treatment of torture survivors, but also the restoration of the social networks that were disrupted by torture, journalism, political affairs, and so forth. And also, there's damage to be done in the torturing society as well. For example, at the peak of the US torturing experience, a lot of people were watching 24, in which Jack Bryan could solve any intelligence problem by cutting somebody's guts out. And it gave the false impression all the way up to the White House that torture worked. And we must insist that media and journalistic presentations of torture accurately reflect the non-utility and the counterproductive nature of torture. We don't allow shows to talk about other human rights crimes as healing or productive in that way. And torture as entertainment is a false depiction of torture, and that's the next circle. With regard to your second half of your question, which was?
It's about thinking about people who are survivors of torture who are then trying to obtain asylum or refugee protections.
Yeah, documentation. The problem here is that we should, it turns out if you ask people who've been tortured, have you been tortured? They don't lie, and they do tell, okay? But they're very rarely asked. And furthermore, the healthcare system is very poor at detecting torture. Even, for example, people who have suffered bastonado, where the soles of their feet are slashed with bamboo stripes or bamboo canes. And they got horizontal stripes across their soles, which causes a long-lasting neuropathic pain when they walk. The docs don't see it. But even so-called subtle forms of torture, like electrical wires under the skin, those wires can produce actually little calcium deposits where the electricity goes off. And the use of the diagnostic studies to develop that confirmatory evidence, in addition to the physical exam, is something that's not done and must done to improve the evaluation of asylum petitions. So first, we need to have docs routinely ask, especially in high-risk populations. Secondly, we need to have them know how to use inventories such as the Istanbul Protocol to evaluate for signs of torture injuries. For example, ordinary exams tend to focus on vital organs. Torture is often done to ligaments and joints like the shoulder. And third, we need to have much better use of technological means of assessing torture, which produce high-grade forensic evidence, both for the behalf of the victim, but also, or survivor, but also with regard to prosecuting the torturer.
Thank you.
If I could follow up on that, I was just going to ask you about the Istanbul Protocol. Could you explain what that is?
Sure.
And how widespread that is now in terms of how it's used in the clinical environment?
Yeah, the problem is that torture is such an irregular crime that standard means of physical examination don't work. And so the exam that I was taught as a doc is really not very useful on torture. And so the Istanbul Protocol is a means to evaluate a victim or survivor looking for particular stigmata of torture. We have clean evidence. We know what torture is, but we have to turn our eyes to focus on those specific patterns of injury. And you can Google it to see what's in it. The problem with the Istanbul Protocol is that the Istanbul Protocol is very poor at assessing, indeed it doesn't assess the psychological sequelae of a torture. And so the problem is that certain crimes, for example, solitary confinement for a long time, or extreme psychological abuse or rape, simply don't produce things that are detectable by the Istanbul Protocol. And we need a much better way to generate to have a clinical tool that is as specific for psychological sequelae of torture as for a physical sequela.
And again, following on that, a couple of years ago, and I'm sure you remember this very well, I think it was Atul Gawande did a very influential piece in the New Yorker about solitary confinement as torture.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because there, as we've learned more about wrongful convictions and inequities in the justice system, there's a new sort of focus on solitary confinement as a form of torture, and quite an effective one in the sense that it really has a huge impact on somebody's well-being. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the UN has defined solitary confinement as a form of torture. It's widely practiced in the United States. And the problem with solitary confinement is both the damage it causes and also that it occurs entirely outside of the controls of the justice system. That is inflicted by the wardens rather than by the courts. And so the wardens can just keep piling it on. And we've had people, for example, I had lunch with a guy about 3 years ago who'd spent 18 years in solitary confinement in Louisiana. New York has abandoned solitary confinement. In third world settings, solitary confinement is not as common as other forms of torture because they don't have the financial resources to sequester people. But in countries, for example, like Russia or China, it is still, or the US, it's still widely practiced.
Other questions from online? Stephanie, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so first I want to say thank you for coming today and doing this research. I'm sure it's not easy to do. And so my question, since your role as a medical doctor studying this, I'm curious if there's any research for epigenetics about the descendants of folks who endure this type of trauma that goes on with torture. And if you could speak a little bit to if the people who are tortured later do have children and what the effect is on them.
That's a great question. There's clean evidence with regard to epigenetics, from epigenetics, that prolonged stress during a person's life resets the epigenetic header on genes to cause stress-related sequelae, response sequelae, to appear in the descendant generations. So for example, extreme stress on you over a long period of time would tend to result in higher cortisone levels and hypertension in your children. There is no study of epigenetic inheritance patterns in torture survivors that I know of, although it'd be really worth doing.
Questions from the room? Any other questions from you? Yeah, one moment. Introduce yourself.
So my name is Manal, and my question was, you mentioned earlier how journalists and media have a general duty to report on these things. What do you think is also the role of doctors who are not necessarily interacting with the torture regime, but share that same field to speak out on these things? And moreover, is there, like, in medical schools in the United States, is there an effort to teach students about how to detect some of these more harder to see evidences of torture on victims?
Last question first. There's no significant effort in medical schools to teach how to detect torture or screen for torture, which is a shame, because based on the myth that people will lie for asylum, and also most docs simply don't know anything about torture or its prevalence, so they don't understand that if you got a condition that's 30% prevalent in your suspect population, that it's a good idea to screen for the condition. Journalists, I think, are at fault because they handle torture something like climate change. Here's the opinion that it works, and here's the opinion that it doesn't work, and it was done, and so we got this issue. And the controversial technique of torture. It doesn't work. The journalists should say that, just like they should say vaccines work, the anti-vaxxers are nuts. And the other problem with journalists is that journalists tend to stigmatize or torture in developing countries and to excuse it in wealthy peer nations. Spain, for example, the United States have huge problems with torture. Britain tortured extensively in Northern Ireland. That is still going on. As long as we are going to politically gerrymander our critiques of torture, and then I think what we're going to do is we're not going to be able to come up with a unified approach to complete the elimination of it. And on that point, I want to say now that far fewer people are at risk of torture or being tortured today than say 100 years ago. So we've made progress. And then I think that the other role for journalists is journalists and the entertainment industry as a whole has developed some sensitivity to how to handle things like rape and suicide, and to try and minimize, say, copycat gun slaughters, but they have not done that with regard to torture. They continue to make torture a form of entertainment. It is a staple on TV. You can watch torture any night on TV. None of my friends in the torture abolition community, none of my friends who teach torture survivors can watch this stuff. And I think that we're not going to get to a kinder world community as long as we have somebody working over James Bond with a tennis racket on his balls.
Nicely put. Other questions from the room? Other questions from online? Any final questions? Yeah, go ahead, Maya.
I was just wondering why you think that torture is so prevalent when the research shows that it doesn't work. Do you think it's mostly due to the entertainment and media, or are there other factors that you think play a role in why torture continues to happen at such a high rate?
That's a great question. I think part of it is that the people who torture don't read the research reports. For example, when the American Psychological Association embarked on a torture policy for Abu Ghraib, they did not look at one of the research reports with regard to what was known about coercive interrogation. The second thing is that a guy called Darius Rejali in Torture and Democracy defines torture as a folkway, that it is not taught as a craft like the things you learn in school, or a skill like evidence-based skill that you learn in school, but rather it's taught from sergeant to a soldier. Okay, and then what happens is that soldier moves over to another base and says, you know, over at base A, we do it this way, and teaches it here. For example, I got interviewed a while ago on a case of using interrectal gasoline in northwestern India. And I was actually able to trace 18 different cases at various police departments all around up there. And so it had spread as a little folkway. The same goes for the use of falsifying birth certificates in Argentina. And so these techniques actually spread by a subterranean communication system that is not subject to evidence-based correction and impervious to evidence-based evidence coming into the system.
One of the things we looked at on Wednesday was some of the testimony by John Burge in Chicago about the Chicago torture cases and the Chicago Torture Project, which did such great work. And it was so interesting to hear him being questioned. He never answered, he pled the fifth to every question, but about the fact that he had been a soldier in Vietnam and had tortured as a part of Operation Phoenix, and then had brought those same techniques back home to the south side of Chicago. And then there was that guy, you probably remember his name, who had been a prison guard in I think it was West Virginia, who was then deployed with the National Guard to Abu Ghraib. And he used the torture methods that he'd learned in the prisons of West Virginia on detainees. His first name was Charles, you probably remember his name, was the famous guy, along with Lindy something. But he was basically this kind of transnational torture also, where these techniques are used either in a war or in a prison, and they're very transferable. They travel.
I think that's right. I mean, for example, a really good one in this regard is flogging under medical supervision. This practice was invented by the British Navy, and it then spread through the entire Commonwealth. And if you look at the world map of medically supervised flogging, you basically see that it overlays the former British Empire. And to my mind, what that says is that then Britain should be taking the lead in both, first off, paying damages to the people that it flogged who are still living. It didn't illegalize flogging until about 1975, I think. And secondly, that it should develop a way to eradicate this practice in all the members of its former Commonwealth where it distributed the practice. The same goes, the United States was a leading supplier of electrical generators throughout South America in Operation Condor. And I think that these kind of large-scale vectors, which were culturally done, also offer a way to get the general message out, the broader message out, that torture doesn't work, so that if you knock out flogging under medical supervision, you have an opportunity to address the broader use of corporeal prison techniques in say, Malaysia.
I have sort of lost, you know, in North Carolina, we're on, we've been talking about the death penalty as well. We're on year 15 of essentially an informal moratorium on the death penalty, partly based on racial justice issues and partly based on torture issues, in the sense of the use of lethal injection as cruel and unusual punishment. And before this informal moratorium started, there was a fight over medical doctors supervising executions. Do you know where that is now in other states like Louisiana and Texas that are still executing people?
Well, there's obviously still capital punishment in the United States. I testify or supply legal briefs for some of the medical briefs for some of these cases. I think it's important to recognize, first off, docs have no role as executioners. Our job is healing. The question of docs as certifying death is a borderline case as long as the doc isn't involved. And if the doc says he's not dead, then he gets an additional dose of whatever it is. The problem is this method of so-called humane drug injections has never been tested or validated whatsoever. There is, for example, no lethal dose calculation for potassium whatsoever. It doesn't exist. There is no data whatsoever. We know that potassium causes arrhythmia, but how much potassium is required, nobody knows. The second issue is that with regard to lethal doses of Lorazepam, the LD50, that is the dose of Lorazepam that'll cause death in 50% of human beings, has never been calculated and can't be calculated even in mice. We don't know what it is. Lorazepam is not a lethal drug. You can give a drug that'll suppress respirations, which is often given as part of a execution. But what it does is it paralyzes breathing muscles, has no effect on consciousness. And so the person is awake while they suffocate. They just can't move to express the fact that they're suffocating. I testified in a case in South Africa on a guy who, on a doc who had dispensed cyanide pills. And he was asked, how long does it take cyanide pill to kill? And he said, oh, just, you know, a second or two. It's really fast. Well, he was getting his information basically off of the depiction of cyanide murder in Agatha Christie. Cyanide essentially uncouples the ability of hemoglobin in the blood to carry oxygen. And so it's a chemical form of asphyxiation. So, and it takes about 3 to 5 minutes, and it has all the symptoms of asphyxiation. So I don't think we should have anything to do with the process. Fortunately, the international drug companies are refusing to supply drugs to the United States. It turns out in a huge report that came out about 2 months ago that the states have been hiding their bad experiences, that there were many more horrendous executions than were reported in the newspapers. They said people died peacefully, they didn't. And I think that executions are probably on the way out in the United States, and it'll be too late rather than soon enough.
Any final questions in the room? Final questions online? I just wanted to invite you, Dr. Miles, you're talking to some people who are considering going into the medical profession. Is there any advice you'd like to impart or observations about becoming physicians or physician assistants or nurses or what have you?
Yeah, I think, you know, people say, well, we should be teaching human rights in law school. Docs, I mean, medicine is essentially a liberal art and should be considered as such. But we neglect the fact that besides a brain and a heart, the number one required organ of a doc or nurse is a spine. And if the docs had at Abu Ghraib had said, look, this is going to really hurt us as well as it's hurting the prisoners down the road, and they'd stopped it, an enormous amount of grief would have been prevented. The same goes for the cops who stood next to
You're talking about the George Floyd case?
Yep.
Yeah.
Eric Chauvin.
Yeah, Eric Chauvin. We just have to have a spine. If a drug company asks you to fake research, if a insurance company says you can't have this valid therapy because it costs too much, it's the doc's role to stand up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Miles, for coming to speak to us. We can